Now I'd like to welcome to the show Siri Terjesen, Executive Director of the Madden Center for Value Creation, and Phil Smith, Professor of Entrepreneurship at Florida Atlantic University. Welcome to Free the Economy, Siri.
Thanks so much, Richard. Great to be with you.
So, the last several years we've heard a lot about in the world of business and politics, world of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investing, and that's all about how corporations are expected to prioritize things like climate impacts or worker quality of life to the same degree that they do profits for shareholders. And there's been a lot of debate about that and how you apply that to corporate behavior today. And some proponents of this ESG movement tend to present it as a sort of a new business trend, this sort of new cutting edge thing that they're introducing into the world of capital and markets. But I feel like these sort of ESG type concerns are actually pretty old in the world of business management.
Absolutely, Richard. And that's been something that I've thought of, especially in recent years when these calls are intensified, but certainly as you've read and documented, and I've certainly read and documented since the dawn of time, we've had great capitalists who are also concerned with others.
Yeah, and you can certainly go all the way back to things like uh, stories from the Bible about the parable of the talents and things like that, and questions about rules through the Middle Ages about how masters in guilds should be treating their apprentices and how they should be feeding them and disciplining them. Uh, but when it comes to sort of something that is kind of recognizable to us today in terms of like the kind of businesses. I feel like we've probably even then we've got like 200 years probably of history that's sort of recognizable to us today. And I know I think I mentioned this before we came down to record here. Um, One book that I think is really interesting was written by longtime business school prof James O'Toole, who's now retired from USC, and he wrote a book called Enlightened Capitalist: Cautionary Tales of Business Pioneers Who Tried to Do Well by Doing Good. There's already two words in that long subtitle that make us uh, give us some caution. But so he wrote many of these short biographical profiles of famous business leaders who often thought of themselves as rather enlightened. We can talk about whether they all were or not. But going back to say Robert Owen, who's a guy who ran spinning mills in the early 19th century, uh, he was known for really trying to go out of his way to give his workers um, uh, access to even some of the things that may be considered state responsibilities today, like access to better medical care and education for their children and things like that on site where his facilities were, and made that a big part of what his business was about, not just making good quality cloth, but being a good place to work. And we've got again in that book, James O'Toole's book, people some famous names like William Lever and J.C. Penney, Robert Wood Johnson, and some possibly not quite as well known people like William Norris, who's a computer executive. Um, what does that first sort of like 100 years before the modern era of business, of sort of enlightened business, what can that kind of like teach us today about all these conferences and debates about things like climate policy and ESG?
Thank you, Richard. I'll even have a little prop here of the book so folks can take a look at it. It's quite a read. I also recommend the audio version of it while you're doing other work. So although certainly there are criticisms of the book, which you've done a nice job reviewing in the Cato Journal, um, I take with you the premise that there are some really great stories here, which go back more than 100 years, which inspired, frankly, some of the folks who we think about as the modern philanthropists. So we could talk about some other books. I just finished reading my neighbor, Leon Cooperman, who lives in Boca and sometimes gives talks to our students at the university. In his book, he starts by saying, I was inspired by Andrew Carnegie. And when we look at this book, we can imagine that Andrew Carnegie was inspired by the folks who came before him. And if I take kind of a step back, I come to all of this, you know, growing up in Northeast Ohio, being a huge fan of history, being very grateful for the amenities in my community, and recognizing that those really date back to at least 1900, in some cases earlier, and that these stories have always existed. I've got lots of business books behind me because, like James O'Toole, I'm a business school professor, but the business history discipline is really the tiniest, I would say, of all of the disciplines within business. So these stories don't always come to light. Plus, they contradict some of the popular narrative, which is that, capitalism needs to be absolutely torn apart.
Well, yeah, and I'm thinking about there's sort of a shift between the 19th century enlightened capitalists with someone like Andrew Carnegie's being sort of at the end of the 19th century and the more 20th century idea of where we get phrases like corporate social responsibility, uh, because I feel like and of course there are ways to quantify this, and plenty of business and management people have looked at that. But a lot of the biggest companies in the 19th century were family run, were run by founders themselves or their children, and were directly controlled by the people who created them. Whereas by the 20th century, you get a lot of firms are large, they're publicly traded, they're widely held, they're dispersed, and they have hired managers. And if whoever might have been the original founder of that company or one of its constituents, because often companies get bigger when they merge and buy out competitors, uh, there might no longer be any connection between the founding family and the current operations of the corporation. And so that creates, to me, it creates a sort of a different situation. And what would you expect of a business enterprise when the person who is the president is also the majority shareholder, also founded the company, also hired most of the senior managers, and has a sort of direct control, and they identify with the company much more than a hired CEO would? How do you h- how does that affect, you think, that structure, which itself is sort of just an amoral, a amoral, non-moral, mathematical thing? How does that play out in management?
Oh, that's a great question because these are, frankly, two different types of enterprises, right? So the privately held family firm versus a large corporation that's publicly traded, that's under pressure. By the way, probably five of the largest shareholders would be Vanguard, State Street, et cetera, pressuring. But maybe we should first go back in time and think about those um, examples, even starting from the 1850s and fast forwarding, because a lot of those companies that existed as privately held family businesses then, later became publicly traded companies,
Right.
or at least in the public domain. Um, and I would say, first of all, I think all research topics for folks are personal in some regard, and that this issue could become personal and also clear to your listeners by thinking about their own experiences. For example, if they grew up in America and they enjoyed some amenities and some wonderful communities. So as I said earlier, I grew up in Northeast Ohio. My mother's family were basically immigrants from Northern Ireland into Cleveland in the 1850s. And my dad's family were basically immigrants from Norway to Brooklyn and then to Akron, Ohio. And so these are two big cities in Ohio, Akron and Cleveland. And both of them, um, the story really is about those entrepreneurs with often privately held family businesses, who became major philanthropists and also frequently came from very humble beginnings. And I knew this because when I would go to downtown Akron and Cleveland, I would visit these places, and my teachers and my parents would mention the fact that these were made possible by other people. And I also knew from my own family that there were some philanthropy going on, even if they were still trying to make something of themselves, right? It didn't just start once you were successful. And so I think it's good to take a trip back and into memory lane on these regards. And there's certainly lots of examples that we can draw from.
Yeah, and I know there's a book I was reading a couple of years back about the sort of history of it's sort of it's called the history of corporate social responsibility before the most recent era. So this was about from 1900 1960 or so, and it was talked about the philanthropy practiced by both individual capitalists and successful individuals and their immediate families, as well as some of these more widely held companies. And the for a while, uh, there seemed to be the belief that an individual who had made a lot of money and still controlled their own company it was reasonable for them to donate even in the company's name, but that a more widely held company shouldn't necessarily be doing that, and that their individual executives should be donating personally instead. What the idea whether it would make it was reasonable for a publicly held company to donate out of the corporate treasury to the local orphans fund or women's hospital or whatnot. And so that was a kind of a fascinating, evolving both ethical and business practice and legal question, because there were, corporate counsels and treasurers at the time who said, "Oh, well, we shouldn't be doing this. We should just encourage our well-paid employees to do it." Um, but one of the things that comes out of that history is that especially when there was a crisis, one of the like economic panics of the late 19th century, or when it was, World War I or the flu pandemic, when there was a big crisis and there was a real need for charitable giving to sort of flood in, it was usually the sort of leading capitalists of a city, out of a community, of a state, who were the leaders of that, who would be the chairman of the fundraising board, or sometimes the wife of the CEO would be the chairwoman of the fundraising board, and they would, through their own kind of civic leadership, drive a lot of donations to what at the time were called the early 20th century called community chests. Everyone who plays Monopoly has heard of community chests. Those were just sort of small local foundations for collecting charitable donations. Um, and that was a big movement in the first third half of the 20th century, where again, often led by wealthy people in communities, but bringing in donations from anyone who had any ability to give at all. And so it became very much a sign of sort of middle class success in America. There's sort of a little bit of the American dream where you can join the donor class in your own modest way, and build up these civic institutions in American life.
In fact, if I interrupt you, that started in Cleveland. So the very first donor advised fund came in Cleveland about 100 years ago. And what you talked about earlier was exactly the case, that there were lots of individual philanthropists. Their wives might be leading the initiative. If you permit me, I'll share another book that I've been reading, which is John D. Rockefeller, The Cleveland Years.
Oh,
I
yes.
only discovered this book because it's written by my second cousin, three times removed. So when I was learning about her, I learned about this book, and she wrote it because her husband worked for the Rockefellers back in the day. And she went to the archives and wrote this book, published it in 1973. So you can imagine the trips, goes through all the accounting spreadsheets and diaries and so forth. And anyway, she tells the story of John D. Rockefeller, who came to Cleveland from Strongsville, where his father was a physician. You didn't make a lot of money back then, because I also had a great great uncle who was a physician in the 1850s. And anyway, came to Cleveland, sent the boys to public school there and had room and board. They didn't have a lot of money, but they always donated to the Baptist church. And even when John D. Rockefeller was working for others and presumably not making a lot of money, in fact, even by the own accounts, he was still donating to causes. And one, the church, the Baptist church, but also he was extremely supportive of newly freed African Americans, because back then Cleveland, not only the site of the first donor advised fund, but also the last stop on the Underground Railroad. So there was a lot of need to get education to these folks, get jobs, integrate them into the community. And it's certainly documented that he made a number of gifts that I took some notes on, but um, certainly to the first congregation for African Americans in Cleveland. Um, Even before he started his own company, he was an executive in someone else's company. He spent, gave some money to someone in Cincinnati to buy his wife, who was presumably still in slavery at the time, made other early donations to the YMCA. He also, um, and to your point about, these catastrophes and pivotal events, this was also during the Civil War. And so there's a story of how someone brought 30 soldiers who were recruited to fight for the Union Army into his office, and he opened the safe and he gave each one of them $10, presumably to give to their families before they went off to war. So, and then one of his classmates was Spelman, who, of course, most of us recognize that name because that's now Spelman University, one of the greatest HBCUs in America, which was founded by her family, and also great gifts from Rockefeller. And again, these are all stories that go back more than 100 years to the great philanthropy, and again with the great causes.
Yeah, and $10 back then in the 1860s was real money back then.
It was. There's some accounting in this book of exactly how much he was giving. And I'm not sure that there were tax deductions back then, right? This
Mhm.
was just giving freely. And he always had this policy. So even though his father, William, was a physician and made some money, but also because he was needing to sell his services and travel around Northeast Ohio, um, even though they didn't have a lot of money, his mother made his and his children and his siblings clothes. She made all her children's clothes. Um, they had this little blue jar they talk about, and they would always find some change there and give it to others. And that started from boyhood.
So yeah, before Rockefeller became the Rockefeller we all know of, the very wealthy businessman. Um, so as we go along, so we're here in the 19th century. We move in the later 19th century. A lot of great American industrial fortunes are made, and a lot of great high quality products and services are sold. We come into the World War I era. We hit the Great Depression. It's a big shakeup. Another time when a lot of the businesses that did not go bankrupt were also expected to donate to funds like local community chess and things like that. And there was a sort of robust debate about how much, again, a publicly held corporation would be expected to donate versus individuals. But then we get after World War II to, again, something that's closer. Uh, the debate post World War II gets a little bit closer to the debate today. So we have a guy named Howard Bowen who writes a book called Social Responsibilities of the Businessman in 1953. And so that becomes, I think, probably the first book to really talk about corporate social responsibility in a way that's more, familiar to as we do now. And I really thought that was interesting with the title he chose because it still refers to the individual instead of the corporation, right? It's social responsibilities of the businessman, not the social responsibility of corporations or of business in general. And but between that time and now, there seems to have been kind of this kind of unspoken switch in the decade over the decades when it comes to business ethics. Whereas originally that was, you know, there were people who wrote books about things like business ethics and ethical conduct, but it was advice to individuals, how you are an individual, you want to conduct yourself morally, of course, and when you go into the profession of business and making money, here is how you should conduct yourself as an ethical individual. Whereas eventually it came to be how should companies be ethical, right? And something I wrote a few years ago that I found this great quote from Peter Drucker, this famous one of the most famous management gurus of all time. He wrote in 1981, which I think is fairly late in his career, that ethics and morality can only be about the individual, and that people, would talk to him all the time about, business ethics, and he, repeated said every moral teacher in since the history of the world began has always said true morality is about every individual person's soul and conscience and what they do. And you can't really have morality in a business as a group. It has to be all the individuals acting morally together. Um, and that's understandable. Most patterns of morality are, in fact, applied to individuals. But of course, corporations have to make institutional decisions every day. And those institutional decisions aren't easily traced to an individual often. So how do we sort of square that? The idea that you can't have real morality that's not based on an individual, yet you have this institution that, as an institutional player, has all sorts of makes decisions that have a lot of consequences.
That that's the debate that goes on today. I I think so that Howard's book was really pivotal. And then the next CSR ESG forerunner book was um, by Ed Freeman. And by then, he certainly had attributed these as values of the organization and the corporation rather than individuals, right? Which is really the trade-off, because um, can all individuals in a corporation agree on what is morally acceptable and ethical? And as you also point out in your review of the book, in what order, right? So who gets in line first and how much do they get? And knowing that maybe by those that are at the end of the line, um, they might not get anything. I have always believed that if you're an individual and an entrepreneur and you own your own business um, and you are the shareholder and you're making decisions about the business, then you're in a good position to make decisions about gifts. But if you're an employee of an organization that's a corporation and you're making gifts on behalf of the corporation, then not all in the company would agree. So let's take a historical example where I think there was far more agreement. So I'm going to go right back to Northeast Ohio. It was like the sixth or eighth biggest state during this time period, by the way. So in about 1900, they got 5 different rubber companies. So they had Goodyear, Goodrich, Firestone Tire and Rubber, where my grandfather worked, Cyberling, and General Tire. And um, something that all those companies could agree is that they needed affordable housing that was high quality, that was close to the factories and the other offices, that the employees and their families should have access to good public education and other amenities. So I think at the time there was probably fairly general agreement on the gifts, which were, for example, to um, build facilities for the employees and their families and others in the community: gyms, pools, bowling alleys, theaters, golf courses. In some cases, you had to pay a little money to access those, like it was $1.50 a month to belong to the Firestone Country Club. But that was, the way that a lot of people who would never have learned how to play golf learned how to play golf. There was a lot of donations of land. So we have this amazing metro park system along the Cuyahoga River. Many of those tracts of land were donated by the tire companies. There's museums, there's all kinds of stuff that I think there you would in principle agree across all 5 of those firms that it's in the best interest to create the best community possible. And it wasn't like as planned as, say, what's now Unilever's Port Sunshine or something else, but it was just, let's create some great amenities to keep people here. Whereas nowadays, you might have corporate giving that's extremely tangential and off compared to the main interests of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've sort of made this distinction kind of informally myself between, we talk about stakeholders. So, it's the shareholders that own the company, but all the other groups that sort of interact with the company in some way are considered stakeholders. And I think there's sort of there's kind of inner stakeholders and outer stakeholders, right? There's sort of people that are very close to the firm, like its employees, right, who are there every workday. They're obviously a stakeholder, and probably, in many firms they are also probably also shareholders individually. But their interests are very closely aligned with the future of the firm, whereas you have other sort of social and political activist groups who might have opinions about what the company does, but don't have a real stake. They're sort of like, you know, in the way we talk about this, they're considered stakeholders. Like an environmental activist group might object to this company, logging rainforests in a developing country or something. They don't particularly like what the company's doing and they have opinions about it, but they're not really a stakeholder in the enterprise, right? They won't be hurt if the company goes out of business. In fact, the most radical activists would want the company to go out of business, right? The Rainforest Action Network wants Exxon to go out of business. They're not invested in its future success, quite the opposite. So when it comes to people talking about, well, corporations should, understand who their stakeholders are and, work with them and try and maximize, benefits for them as well. I think if you're working with what I call your inner stakeholders, right, the people who live closest in the community where your facilities are, the people, your workers, your retirees, I think that probably is a good guide to prioritizing a lot of things in long-term corporate management. But the sort of outer stakeholders, like I say, these are sort of like Lorax shareholders, where in the Dr. Seuss book, it says, who will speak for the trees, and the Lorax just pops up out of nowhere and raises his hand and says, oh, well, I'll speak for the trees, right? So a lot of times when you're a company, there'll be someone who will be like a Lorax shareholder. They'll just kind of show up out of nowhere. You don't know who they are. They don't have any connection to your company or your community, but they'll just raise their hand and they say, well, I'll speak for the orangutans in Malaysia. I'm like, well, are you their contractual deputy? I mean, there's a certain point at which anyone who gets close to a microphone just gets to decide they're a stakeholder and then expect to be treated like they're an integral part of a business, whether or not they actually have an interest in its future success.
Absolutely. I'm smiling because you're reminding me of teaching strategy for the last 25 years or so. And we would have like a 2 by 2 matrix where we would talk about on at least one of these axes, what's the actual stake that this stakeholder has, right? And is that perceived or is it a real stake? And of course, on another axis and elsewhere, you can think about the power, the influence, the constellations of stakeholders, right? So those who speak, all the Loraxes who somehow come together, which of course we've seen recently. And I think, this really gets down to, and you and I have both written about this a lot, the importance of answering the true stakeholders, or else you won't be in business tomorrow. And then no one benefits, right? Not the orangutans, not the other trees, et cetera. And certainly we've had a lot of examples of this. And so, we used to, and I still teach this type of a matrix to think about the stake of those stakeholders. And then the other piece is, oh, sorry, I've accidentally raised my hand in doing that. The other piece of this is that we sometimes think of all these stakeholders as equal, right? So we, in the past, and Sanjay Bhagat and Glenn Hubbard have written a nice article about this, we used to think about how all those stakeholders were at least interpreted through a prism of shareholder value. But instead now there's just a list of stakeholders with equally big size boxes, all influencing the corporation. And it's so important to have the shareholder value piece, which basically includes all the value capture piece, so that you're still creating value for customers. Because if you don't do that at the end of the day, you may not exist in 6 months or even 1 month.
Yeah, and I think there's a great um, compelling example of that in, again, that James O'Toole book, The Enlightened Capitalist, of William Norris, who is the CEO, the founder and CEO of Control Data Corporation, which was a big, actually not much remembered today, but was actually a very big provider of sort of business to business computer equipment, mainframes, and big back before the PC revolution, when computers was a direct to consumer uh, industry. This is basically when the computer industry was only a business to business or business to government situation. So Norris was running neck and neck with IBM and other much bigger companies. He was very successful. He was very driven and a little eccentric. uh, but along the way, he got bitten by the sort of social reform bug, like a lot of these kind of enlightened capitalists did, where he wanted to, in his era was sort of like the 60s and the 70s. He was dealing with um, a lot of things having to do with the civil rights revolution and sort of post, say, 1964, once we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and people started thinking, well, okay, well, we've got these like big important legislation passed. What we need is jobs for Black Americans, among others, and so he started a job training program and tried to aggressively hire people from I guess today we would call underprivileged backgrounds, including reentry of people who had been in the correction system. Um, but he sort of turned it into his whole his whole enterprise, and he began to ignore the very cutthroat high tech world of mainframe computer development, so much so that he sort of siphoned off all of his working capital into his philanthropy, and eventually his company, which had been one of the pioneering companies in computer development, sort of just went out of business entirely. And I think O'Toole subtitles that chapter something like "Too Much of a Good Thing." Um, so one, there's kind of 2 points there. One, your very important basic point, which is unless you keep managing a company for its primary purpose of making money, it won't be around long enough to do any good for anyone. Um, and then the sort of more detailed, prosaic one, which is if you want to be a business philanthropist, you often have to separate your business from your philanthropy, as so many successful CEOs have done. Often they'll retire, they'll stay on the board of their company, someone else will become the CEO, they'll be the head of their family foundation, and they'll prioritize things like very famously Bill Gates, of course. You know, Bill Gates built a multi billion dollar enterprise, uh, but many years ago he stepped down from being the CEO of Microsoft and has been the head of his he and his ex-wife's um, foundation that has done amazing work and saved millions of lives. But that's kind of the paradigm that I think some of these enlightened capitalists kind of either they didn't learn it because they were too early, or they didn't learn it because they just wanted to do things their own way. And I think Norris was very much a guy who liked to do things his own way and not be told what to do. Um, but that there's an absolute way to do both of those things and be very successful at both of those things. And Bill Gates is probably the best example of that. But if you try and spend all of your business revenue on charity, you'll end up not really being able to accomplish either purpose.
Yep. I completely agree with you. And I'll add to that that there are great examples where you could consider continue to have the charity as the core. And again, these are examples of small companies and organizations that are completely focused on that. So I'm fairly passionate about um, you know, getting formerly incarcerated individuals back into life and into the workforce. And I could think of two organizations that I know pretty well, which basically only employ formerly incarcerated individuals and a couple other people. And that's actually the value proposition to customers. They're both in Norway. One of them builds and repairs boats, and that's run by one of my cousins. And then the other one runs a network of climbing gyms across Norway that are staffed by formerly incarcerated individuals. And that's the value proposition for customers. There's also a famous Norwegian company called Monster Bedriften, which means Monsters Inc., like the movie. But those are formerly incarcerated individuals who do the demo of homes or bathrooms and then help you reconstruct those. But those are examples of, small privately held companies or nonprofits where it could be the focus. But you're absolutely right. There are examples where, it has basically become the all-consuming almost personality of the firm, such that they take their eyes off what's really important. We actually have a management theory on this. It's called the attention-based view of management. And basically that is that we can't track everything all the time. And if we get distracted by some things, we might take our eyes off the main piece. That's certainly one of the interpretations of the theory.
And, you know, bringing this sort of now to kind of the current day, you have, um, again, people, there's always people outside the corporation or outside the sort of immediate orbit of the corporation who are wanting to get companies to sign on to pledges, to do certain things, to adopt certain practices, whether it's, hiring union workers or using, quote, fair trade agreement imports, or, lower their greenhouse gas emissions, or what have you. And that this is sort of, one half is sort of ESG type stuff being pushed from outside groups, and then, the other, when uh, senior managers and board members might agree to adopt some of this stuff on their own. And so it's sort of kind of a push and pull, can come from either direction. But when it comes to activists and trying to kind of, browbeat companies into, adopting what they think are, what the activists think are the enlightened policies anyway, it it's often talked about as if this is just something that activists do to companies in general, and companies in general respond, in various ways. But I feel like there's really actually kind of a sliver of companies that are most often targeted just for completely practical reasons, not because they're the sort of quote worst or anything, but because they're large, because they're publicly held and they're subject to shareholder resolutions and things like that, and often they're consumer product companies, so they're companies everyone has heard of, and so and those are the companies whose CEOs are often asked to speak, to testify in front of Congress, and are asked very, probing, strong questions. Um, and and so if, an activist group is going to send out a direct mail letter saying, support our organization, pledge your $50 today, we'll give you a tote bag, and we'll keep the CEOs of America honest, like those people from, you know, Meta or Google or it's Exxon or it's Chevron. But if all of that activism was surrounded a privately held firm no one had ever heard of, someone that makes industrial widgets, maybe they're very important industrial widgets, but uh, it's unlikely that an activist is going to go up to the CEO of mid-sized industrial widget corporation because no one's ever heard of them. So from a management perspective, does that mean that going forward, because we have a lot of kind of political anti-corporate campaigns out there, does it make sense to say, well, you should only invest in privately held firms, or you shouldn't take your firm public, or you shouldn't even get into consumer products. You should get into some obscure, weird industrial thing that no one knows about. That way, no one's ever gonna, like, the chairman of a congressional committee is gonna never to call you to testify because no one knows who you are. Is that where the safety comes from?
I'm smiling again, Richard, because for these reasons, and also for lots of other regulations that the SEC is passing or is thinking about passing, um, there are so many incentives now for publicly traded companies to go private, for buybacks, which we've seen. And even more so, there are incentives to never go public at all. And by the way, um, if you look at what you need for continued economic growth and also to pull out of a period of economic slowdown, you need IPOing firms. And so if you don't get the IPOing firms, you don't get the growth later. And in principle, I think we would like to live in a world where everyone, right? So the police, the fire, the teachers who have public pensions can be invested in these growth firms, and that all that private equity isn't just concentrated, which is, by the way, I think it's 6.5% of the US economy, isn't just concentrated in the hands of a few. Like at least I would like to live in a world where if there are great companies that are publicly traded, they're not under the constant pressure from Loraxes to do things that aren't good in the long term. And so that everyone, in principle, can build a nest egg and enjoy their lives. So certainly we hear this, we see this in the data in firms that aren't going public, or that were public and are going private. There were even some cases in Norway of this when the laws became a little bit too much for some companies. A few delisted from the stock exchange.
Well, yeah, and my colleague John Burlow here at CEI has made this point a lot when it comes to rules about who is a quote accredited investor, right? If you don't have a certain professional background or a certain net worth, you can't invest in certain, ostensibly more risky uh, assets. But that also keeps, as as he has said, as you sort of alluded to, that there's a lot of growth potential there, growth profit potential that that you're locked out of unless you're basically an insider in the world of sort of finance and investing. Um, and so, when one of these, we always talk about, the world of investing. Oh, wouldn't it be amazing if you could go back in time and buy Apple at its IPO price, or Berkshire Hathaway, or whatever. And you could have made so much money. And those sort of growth opportunities for the every once in a while one of those big amazing companies comes along, but if it doesn't IPO, if it stays private because it doesn't want to deal with all of the activist pressure and political oversight and regulations, then anyone who's not already a millionaire will never have that chance. So that's one thing, when it comes to, I mean, I have my own extremist purist vision of a regulation, which is there probably should be little as possible. But I think when you come to the sort of the median American voter and say, well, they might say, well, we want to, protect people from losing too much money from shady investments or whatever. So that's why we have the Securities Exchange Commission and, the CFTC and CFPB and these other government agencies. I think and I understand that point of view, but they should also remember on the other side that there's also a lot of profit potential that they're sort of locked out of in the way that a lot of Americans complain about the most often, right? The idea that the world of finance and investing is a rigged game and only the insiders benefit from it, and it's millionaires becoming bigger millionaires, and that's all there is to it. Well, if we want to sort of democratize that, we need to give regular people a chance at some of these kind of explosive profit opportunities and not lock them away.
Exactly. And I guess I would add to that, one example that we might both agree on, at least in a limited sense, where regular employees can access the capital generated by these firms is employee stock ownership programs. So I know you wrote about this when you reviewed Enlightened Capitalism because he mentions it in this book. But I think um, if you're an employee, I live in Florida where Publix is basically every few miles, and that's an ESOP where any associate who works at least 20 hours a week and accumulates 1,000 hours can get some ownership in the company. Um, I think that's certainly a way for folks to be part of that. But of course, it depends on the quality of that organization, right? So um, and of course, that it's not all of that employees' um, pension and
Right.
retirement savings and investment, but certainly that it's some piece of it. Then I think that's an example that works. And, practically anyone here in Florida, if you want to work for Publix, there's lots of roles there.
All right. Well, Siri, we could keep talking about this business history of enlightened capitalism all day, but we got to wrap it up. This has been fantastic, and I think maybe we could do round two sometime in the future. Um, Thank you for being with us, and tell us, where can everyone find all of your very impressive scholarship?
You're sweet, Richard. Well, it's an honor to be on the show with you and share these ideas. I'm working on all these issues here at Florida Atlantic University. You can typically access scholars research by going to Google Scholar and typing in the name, and you should be able to find some of that research. And you can also find some of my op-eds and also on Twitter too. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with you and others.
Yeah, and if you are a young person who's looking for a place to study about business, apply to Florida Atlantic University. All right, thanks very much, Siri.
Thank you. Great to catch up.